This is Books of Titans, the podcast dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectuals, scientists, and others. We'll talk about what makes these books such classics, and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about what makes them so important and influential.
I wrongly believed that the worst was over, and so I cared less about the time it would take the Americans to figure out that I was not the guy they were looking for. I trusted the American justice system too much, and shared that trust with the detainees from European countries. We all had an idea about how the democratic system works. Other detainees, for instance, those from the Middle East, didn't believe it for a second and trust the American system. Their argument lay in the growing hostility of extremist Americans against Muslims and the Arabs. With every day going by, the optimists lost ground. The interrogation methods worsened considerably as time went by, and as you shall see, those responsible for Gitmo broke all the principles upon which the U.S. was built and compromised every great principle, such as Ben Franklin's, "They that give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." That quote comes from the book I'm going to cover today, Guantanamo Diary by Mohamedou Ould Slahi. This is book 50 of 52 for my 2019 reading list. By the way, I'm Eric Rosted, and I'm coming to you right outside of Nashville, Tennessee. This episode is going to consist of 3 different segments. The first will be an introduction to the book, the author, who suggested it, and my initial reaction. In the second segment, I'll cover 3 different ideas that stuck out to me. And then in the final segment, it'll be the one thing, my one key takeaway from this book, the thing I'm still thinking about. So on to segment 1. The author is Mohamedou Ould Slahi. He was prisoner number 760 at Guantanamo Bay. He's born on December 31st, 1970 in Mauritania. Mauritania is in West Africa. And I'm just going to go over a little bit of detail about Mauritania and then about Mohamedou's life, and just kind of a brief overview of what we're looking at in terms of this book. Mauritania, West Africa, population of 4.3 million. It had been a French colony beginning in the early 1900s until independence in 1960. Landmass-wise, it's about 2 times larger than the country of France. But 90% of that land is uninhabitable as part of the Sahara Desert. So most of the people are on the western portion of the country and southwestern portion. It has a nearly 100% Sunni Muslim population in that country. Mohamedou, he was a smart kid growing up and got a scholarship to study electrical engineering in Germany. While he was there, he got caught up in the cause of his brethren in Afghanistan who were fighting at that time against the Russians. So this is 1991. Mohamedou goes to Afghanistan, joins Al-Qaeda, who is fighting against the Russians, against the communists. And at that point, the U.S. was also on the side of Al-Qaeda, providing support, but also trying to get Russia out of Afghanistan. So Mohamedou joins Al-Qaeda. He takes an oath of allegiance and ends up fighting against the Russians. Once the battle's over, he leaves. He breaks all ties with Al-Qaeda, but that obviously comes to haunt him later in life. He goes back to Germany, finishes his studies and works in Germany for a while, then goes to Canada. So between Germany and Canada, that's 12 years of his life that he spent between those 2 countries, and majority of it in Germany. In 1999, goes to Montreal, Canada, and the big thing that happens there is that he attends a mosque where Ahmed Ressam had also attended. Ahmed Ressam is known for planning the Millennial Plot, and that was basically he had filled a car with explosives, and he was going to drive from Canada to Los Angeles and detonate a bomb at Los Angeles Airport on New Year's Day. He got arrested, and so before any of that happened, but the plot was there. He left Montreal, Canada before Mohamedou arrived, but because they went to the same mosque, that was another black mark on Mohamedou's life, and it would again come back to haunt him later. So when Mohamedou, author of this book, returns back to Mauritania after being in Canada, he gets questioned in Mauritania about his knowledge about this millennial plot to blow up the LAX airport. Fast forward to September 11th. About 3 weeks after that, he is arrested again in Mauritania. He's questioned, he's interrogated for a couple weeks, and they keep asking about him about this millennial plot and then his connection with Al-Qaeda. From there, he's actually sent to Jordan, the country of Jordan, and there it's a little looser on the interrogation, and so they question him for a period of time there. From there, he's sent to Bagram Air Force Base for 2 weeks, and after that is sent directly to Guantanamo in Cuba. And his family doesn't know where he is at any of these points. They just know that he's being taken in for questioning in Mauritania, and the next they hear, it's from a German newspaper, they hear that he is now in Guantanamo Bay. So in Guantanamo, he's interrogated. He's part of the special interrogation plan signed off by Donald Rumsfeld, to where they can do more things to him. So in this book, he details the torture that he went through, the special interrogation methods that were used against him to try to get more information. Throughout this whole time, he had never been to the U.S., and Guantanamo is held by the U.S., but it's not. It's part of Cuba, so I don't think he still has ever been to the United States. But he was always being questioned by the United States and interrogated by the United States. He started writing this book while in prison. So going back, he arrives at Guantanamo August 5th, 2002. He starts writing a diary in 2005, and anything that a prisoner in Guantanamo says is classified. So this book didn't come out until 2015. They tried to get him released in 2010. Mohamedou had a habeas corpus petition that was granted, but then the Obama administration appealed that ruling, so he remained in Guantanamo. His mother died March 27, 2013, so he never saw his mother again. This book was released in 2015, so 10 years after he wrote it, his diary was finally released, although it was released heavily redacted. There were 2,500 redactions, and a redaction is basically, if you've ever seen a document that is released from the government and then it's just blacked out. So there'll be words blacked out, there'll be entire sections blacked out, and so that's the version of the book that I got. I got the 2015 edition, and there are whole sections of almost 5 pages of just complete blackout. In other times it'll be phrases or words, sometimes the occasional paragraph, but heavily redacted. And an editor, Larry Seams, put all this together, and he put in footnotes. He could not communicate with Mohamedou while the book was being published, so he guessed on a lot of things. And the footnotes were really an amazing part to this, because he would also highlight and link to other reports, and those reports would confirm a lot of what Mohamedou was writing in this book, even about people and different events and all that, dates. So that was neat to see those footnotes, and then the editor would guess on what was being redacted. And I didn't know this at the time I chose this book or that I bought this book. There is also a second version of this book. And the second version came out in 2017, and it is unredacted. And so I actually purchased the unredacted version of the book as well. And so I read the redacted version, but then I got access almost like the last day I was reading this book. I got in the mail, I got the unredacted version. And what's really neat about the unredacted version is it instead of a black line covering the text, they have it in gray so you can read. So you can read the unredacted version, but still see what the U.S. government had originally redacted. The footnotes are updated a little bit. There's a lot of footnotes where he was guessing. Those are just removed now that we have the actual text that was there. And then there's a new introduction to this restored edition of the book. So really neat to see see that and compare the two different versions. And amazing just to see what was redacted and what wasn't. But the end of the story here is that Mohamedou was released from Guantanamo on October 17th, 2016. Remember that he arrived August 5th, 2002. 14 years, 5,445 days of confinement. Things that Mohamedou was charged with, the fact that he had sworn allegiance to Al-Qaeda. When he did that, they were fighting against the Russians, so he was actually on the same side as the USA at that point. He went to the same mosque as the Millennium Plot would-be bomber. That guy had left before Mohamedou had arrived in Montreal, but the U.S. government had said that somehow Mohamedou was the mastermind of the Millennial Plot. Another thing that was against him is that his brother-in-law, Abu Hafs, was a spiritual advisor to Osama bin Laden. And this brother-in-law actually opposed the attacks, wrote a letter to Osama bin Laden saying it was against the Quran, broke off ties after 9/11. Mohamedou was divorced from this wife, so this, was not his brother-in-law anymore, but that was still another connection. And so these are the things that the U.S. government was saying against Mohamedou. But as Mohamedou says, or one of the guards in the book says, knowing somebody is not a crime. One of the other guards said this, and probably another reason that he was kept in captivity for so long. Yes, you are. You are very smart. To me, you meet all the criteria of a top terrorist. When I check the terrorist checklist, you pass with a very high score. I was so scared, but I always tried to suppress my fear. And what is your FBI checklist? Well, you're Arab, you're young, you went to jihad, you speak foreign languages, you've been in many countries, you're a graduate in a technical discipline. And what crime is that? I said. Look at the hijackers. They were the same way. End quote. So those are the things that he was charged with, that they were interrogating him about, but he was never charged with a crime in those 14 years of captivity, in those 5,445 days. As for who suggested this book, I heard about it first in the Daily Peanut. And I've mentioned before that I don't read the news anymore. I do get one email a day, just a broad overview of the news, and that is a thing called the Daily Peanut. You can sign up for it as well. So that's where I first heard about this book, and then they linked to an NPR article where one of the guards at Guantanamo, once Mohamedou was released, this guard went to Mauritania to visit with Mohamedou. That's one of the neat things in this book is Mohamedou almost becomes friends with some of the guards and has rapport with them. And so, yeah, neat. I read this book from November 5th through the 10th of this year, so I just finished it a few days ago, 2019. It's a 372-page book, so I read about 74 pages per day. It took me 7 hours, 50 minutes, and 53 seconds, about a minute 16 per page. And again, I highlight that so that you know about how long it might take you to read the book. As for my initial reaction, this was a really hard book to read. I'll get into a lot of the reasons for that in this episode, but very, very hard to read. Who should read the book? If you're interested in the war on terror, the full ramifications for all that entailed, this is the only diary to come out of Guantanamo. And so it's, in that sense, it's a very important historical record. Also, if you're curious as to just looking at redaction. So when the government goes through a document and crosses stuff out, what are they redacting? It's a very interesting book in that sense, and especially now with the restored edition available. You can see what was redacted, what they redacted, and it's amazing because like one of the things that the government redacted was the use of the word she. So when Mohamedou was talking about the guards, anytime it was a female guard, they would remove the fact that it was a female guard. So they wanted to protect that for some reason. The large sections where it's like 5 pages of just straight black lines covering everything that's written, those covered 2 different polygraph tests that Mohamedou took. So it, like, not everything is super secretive in there, but they just redacted the entire sections. So that's interesting too. Like, why did they do that? The redactions were not uniform. They would cut out almost every single use of the word she, but then there'd be one she in there that they either forgot to do or left it in for some reason. And so you'd think if they're going to go through this document and redact it, they'd spend some time on that, but it was not uniform, and they would let names that were redacted throughout the document, they would let it slide at one point just for some reason. And then on page 229 of the original version of the book, they redacted the word tears. And the editor even makes a footnote. He says this: "It seems possible, if incredible, that the U.S. government may have redacted the word tears." And that's when Mohamedou, he's so overwhelmed at one point that he starts to cry, and he says, "No worry, you going back to your family," he said. When he said that, I couldn't help breaking in redacted, but it's the word tears. And then when we look at the restored version of the book, it was in fact the word tears. And so for some reason, the U.S. government redacted the word tears. This is a really unique book. First, it's a diary, and it's a diary from a prisoner. It's one that came out 10 years after it was actually written, and at that it came out heavily redacted, but then 2 years later, 12 years after it was written, it comes out unredacted. And so we're not even able to read it for 10 years at least. And it's so personable. He's talking about the humanity of the guards. You would just think someone in that situation who's being tortured would just not even care to see any humanity in the guards, but he ends up befriending some of the guards. One of the guards visits him in Mauritania after he's released. And so there's just so many different aspects that make this a unique and interesting book. And I said in segment 1 that it's a very hard book to read. And I'm going to talk about the reasons why it's hard to read. But I don't want that to take away from the importance of the book and its uniqueness. So here are some of the things that were hard things to read about. And the first one is torture. So Mohamedou has this comment in the book. He says, "I didn't believe that Americans torture, even though I had always considered it a remote possibility." End quote. Same for me. I didn't believe that Americans tortured. I grew up thinking that, and I grew up being proud of that. One of my greatest fears in life is somehow getting in the hands of somebody who would, or some group that would torture me. I just don't know what I would do. I just fear that. And growing up, my mom always taught me that it could happen, and would kind of talk about ways to prepare mentally. And it wasn't totally out of the realm of possibility. I grew up in the United States, but we would hear people speak who had been tortured. And maybe it was either for being a Christian in a specific country, or they were part of the military and they had been captured and were a POW and had been tortured. And I remember hearing these people speak and how they got through it, and hearing about some of the horror of that, but being able to make it through that. And so in my mind, it was always a possibility, but there's something in my head saying, I'm glad that we don't as a country. I'm glad I live in a country that doesn't do that to others. And so in 2003, when we started seeing these photos come out of Iraq in what U.S. soldiers were doing to the prisoners, and reading the accounts, that came as a shock to me, in a deep disappointment. You may think that's naive. Perhaps we've tortured along the way. I know there's been atrocities that have been committed, but as a whole, it seems that we as a country had not gone down the route of torture. So to see it come out of Iraq and then to read these accounts in Guantanamo, it's deeply disturbing, and it's a stain on our nation, and it's a stain on our national consciousness as well. And for me, it was a deep disappointment. So some of the torture that Mohamedou, I won't go into everything, but here's just one example of just kind of the sadistic nature of it. Mohamedou had a toilet in his room, and one of the guards would make it so that his toilet had to be dry. That was one of the requirements. The toilet had to be dry. But if you used the toilet, and they would give him water all the time to make him sleep deprived. So he's having to go to the bathroom all the time, and then you flush it, and of course the whole thing gets wet. So in order to keep it dry, he needed something to keep it dry with, but they did not give him anything. So there was no towels in the room. There's nothing that he could use in the room to keep it dry. So the only thing he could use was his clothes. So he had to take off his clothes to wipe the toilet so it would not be wet. So the clothes get wet. They obviously smell of pee and poop, and then his room is kept at such a cold temperature that when he puts those clothes back on after wiping the toilet dry, he's even more cold, he's shivering, and again, that just keeps him awake. And there's a lot of different things that happen that he recounts in this book. A lot of these are known things, and as you're reading the book, you'll see a footnote where there's a document available where you can see how these interrogation methods were approved and signed off at the highest levels. And so it's all very deeply disturbing. But it was all trying to get information out of Mohamedou and then other prisoners as well. But it led to this catch-22 situation where torture was used to get the information, but the information could not then be used as testimony or in court. And so I think they were probably just using it to try to get immediate intel to stop other attacks, but it had these unintended consequences of, one, not being able to use it further down the road, and then secondly, a lot of the information that they're getting from prisoners who are under torture was not valid information. They were just basically wanting the torture to stop, so they were telling the guards whatever they thought they wanted to hear. And in fact, it seems that one of the reasons Mohamedou is kept in prison for so long is someone else gives his name under torture. And it wasn't correct that his name was given, but it seems that's one of the reasons that he's even kept in there further. So Mohamedou admits to lying just to stop the torture. And so it just makes you, it's just it really is Catch-22. I read Catch-22 a long time ago, but when you're reading about the torture in this book, it almost has that same feel that you have in Catch-22, that there's horrible situations that are happening, and they're not leading to anything productive. And in fact, they're probably hurting more than they're helping. And so torture, just reading about it, being confronted with it, that deep disappointment again was the first main thing in this book that was difficult to read. The second thing is that this went to the top level. President Bush was briefed on Mohamedou. Rumsfeld signed the documents to allow the enhanced interrogation. So this is not like Guantanamo section of Cuba, rogue. It's not this military group that went rogue and they're doing things that are not allowed. Perhaps it was secret in the sense that the American public was not aware, but it wasn't a rogue thing. It would be so much easier to accept and write off, I guess, if it was just a group of rogue soldiers going crazy. But it's not. It was signed off at the highest level. And that's another area where it just gets really disturbing. Another thing is just why is this important? We're talking about one guy here. Like why is this important? There's a major war on terror going on, and if this was going to stop, if getting information from this prisoner was going to stop another attack, why is this important? And I guess one thing I kept thinking about is how do we treat the least of these? How do we treat those in prison? How do we treat, as a country, should we be known for the great things, the great cities, the big military we have, or should we be known for how we treat those who cannot defend themselves? And something that just kept coming up over and over that I was thinking about in this book. And then also for why is this important? It in Frederick Douglass' book that I highlighted earlier this year, amazing part where he's talking about what slavery did to the slave owners. And he said it was as bad, the mark on the soul of the slave owners, as it was for the slaves. And that's an amazing statement for someone who had been in slavery to say, who had been whipped, who had been estranged from his family forcibly, for him to make that statement. But you see the same thing in this book. It's not just the prisoners, and in Mohamedou's case, an innocent prisoner. It's not just him that's going through the torture. It's not just him going through the pain. It's the guards themselves. One of the guards at one point says, "I know I can go to hell for what I have done to you." And that's something that guard has to live with the rest of his life. It's collateral damage. It's not just the prisoner, it's the guard. But further than that, it's not just the system. It kind of goes back to my first point about being disappointed in our country in a way for the torture. So it expands beyond that. When Mohamedou was interrogated in Mauritania, he was interrogated by FBI agents. He was interrogated by people from the United States. Mohamedou had never been in the United States. He had never done anything against the United States, but he was being interrogated by the United States. Just think of, like, what if China what if an interrogator came over from China, you were arrested, and they were interrogating you instead of somebody from the US? Just kind of flip the shoe there a little bit. Another interesting thing, and why is this important, is kind of going back to that first quote I read, where he talks about our founding principles. And one of the complaints against the British king that is listed in our Declaration of Independence is a complaint for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. So again, it just kind of comes full circle. Why is this important? It goes beyond just what we did to one person. It says a lot more than that, and it's a violation of what we hold to be as a country. Now on to segment 3, and my one key takeaway with this book. As I'm sure you could tell in the last segment, this was an uncomfortable book in many ways. So my one key takeaway, it's not something I can implement in my life to make my life better or anything like that, but it's a question, and it's an uncomfortable question. And it's one that kept coming up as I was reading this book, and it's this: am I okay with this? Am I okay with this going on? And I'm obviously not, but this is the first time I've really thought about it. I had a vague sense of what was going on at Guantanamo. From the information I allowed in, I knew, or it seemed that prisoners were being treated well. I mean, in my mind, these were supposedly the worst of the worst. And if you needed to do some enhanced interrogation to get information that might help stop another attack, well, maybe that had to be done. And that was, I just kind of bought all that hook, line, and sinker. I never stopped to think of what if there's somebody who's innocent there? What if the enhanced interrogation is going well beyond what I thought? What if it is torture and not enhanced interrogation? What if I thought my country never went that far, but now they're going that far, and they're going that far at a time when I'm alive? Is there something I can do? Is there something I can say or try to stop this? So these are the kind of questions. Am I okay with this? No, I'm not. But what do I do? What do I do going forward? And that's kind of the uncomfortable place I'm at after finishing this book just a few days ago. I'm glad I read it. It's one of those where it's kind of like Schindler's List. It's not an enjoyable movie, but it's an important one. This is an important book, and it's important on many different levels. It was amazing to me to see what was redacted, what the U.S. government didn't want to have come out. It's amazing that he was never charged with anything. Mohamedou was never charged with any crime, but was kept in prison for all those years. Never got to say goodbye to his mom. His mom died while he was in prison. Am I okay with this? Are you okay with it? I want you to check out the show notes. I'm going to put some links to some articles and more information from this book. If you decide to read it, you might as well get the restored edition, because you actually see what was redacted, and you can follow Mohamedou. He's on Twitter, and so interesting story, deeply disturbing, but very important. I hope you read it. If you do, let me know. That's going to do it for this episode. Thanks for listening. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear what you think about this book. Maybe other podcast episodes where you've also read the book. One of the reasons I started this project was to talk to other people about the books that I was reading. So you can email me at Erik, ERIK, at booksoftitans.com. That's going to be the best place to contact me. So let me know what you thought about this episode or this book or other ones as well. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, and I have a lot of information on the website that can help you get started with a reading plan of your own. I have some great book recommendations there. I'll be back next week and be covering another book. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.